Hello guys, this is Svetlana from Cosplay, and today I'm finally going to show you how I made my demonic Brigitte cosplay. Part 1. So after making only very small and simple costumes like an Gigante or Zinogre, I finally wanted to accept a real challenge. So I asked Zack Fisher, who is really famous for his custom Blizzard design, and he took Brigitte from Overwatch and gave her a really amazing custom Diablo skin. And while this costume is absolutely fun and exciting to bring to life, it actually also takes a tiny little bit longer than I expected. So I thought I would be done like in 3 months. Not going to happen. I actually started in August 2019 and I'm still not done. It's like 8 months, I don't know, I forgot to count anymore. Well, so this video actually will take a while, so I thought I'm going to split it into 2 parts, but still grab some tea and get comfy. And yeah, and if you still have any questions regarding to the products I used for this costume, you will find plenty of product links in the video description down below. And if you have also any questions to armor making or to painting or how to install lights, all techniques I used in this video as well, go and check out my cosplay crafting books on cosplay.com. Buy my books, and now let's start with the video. So before I actually start with all the crafting parts, keep in mind that I didn't make each piece one after the other, as you will see in this video. I actually built several of the costume pieces at the same time to make sure all the proportions work out the way I had them in mind. This way I wouldn't have to redo a whole piece from the ground up and could redo corrections much faster. Anyway, with this out of the way, let's just start. This is what my reference looked like. Zack gave me a front and a back view of the costume, and also one version without the shield. To get a good size reference, I printed out the line art in real life size, taped all printed pages together, and attached the cutout to my photo wall. As you can see, Brigitte has quite crazy proportions though. Her hands are really massive, and she would probably have a hard time finding fitting shoes. My starting point for this project was the cute left shoulder. I got some 10mm low density EVA foam and used one of my sphere patterns as a base. You can find a download link in the video description. So these were my cutout foam pieces, which I then glued together and shaped them into a half sphere. For this I used contact cement, which is great to connect foam. Please check out my video description for all the materials and tools I used for this project. Then, based on my round shape, I drew another pattern on paper, cut it out, and copied it to 10mm high density EVA foam. This material is just more rigid and I prefer it for sanding work. So I drew some markings and began to roughly carve out the shape. Doing this makes sanding afterwards a lot easier. Afterwards I grabbed my Dremel and smoothed out the surface. Next I connected both parts to each other. Just had to squeeze a little bit here and there. For the spikes I cut out a few curvy triangles and glued them together carefully along the edges. As you can see, making these shapes is super simple. Now I just stuck them on and looks already much better, right? For the following step, I had to cut out a huge hole. This would become the mouth later. Now we need some gums and teeth. To create the texture, I chose to use foam clay. I just had to apply some water onto my foam to make it stick and then spread the foam directly onto it. Afterwards, I just squished some clay teeth in it that I made before. Everything else then got covered with even more foam clay. I added some details here and there and it looked like I was done. But then, I don't know, I hated it. So I ripped all the teeth off again, cut the mouth bigger and angrier, and remodeled this whole area again. Now a short sizing test. Looks good. While the clay was drying, I grabbed some translucent plaster-soaked foam next and made a second half sphere out of it. I plan to light up this area. So I soldered LED strips into a spiral, glued it onto some white wobbler, and then placed everything underneath the foam. And now you can see why this material is also called LED foam. The fitting test looked good so far, and the last step was to add some more holes and some battle damage with my Dremel and soldering iron. And this was how the final pauldron build looked like. Next up was building the snappy bone looking collar. I started with one layer of 10mm foam, added a second one to shape a curve, and then carved it roughly into shape. Afterwards, I covered the material with foam clay, placed some pre-made teeth on top, and finally ripped everything off again. The teeth were too small and thin for me, and so I wanted to replace them with larger, thicker ones. Well, then I sculpted the top again and made everything nice and snappy. Once the clay dried out, I added textures with my Dremel and my soldering iron. And this was the final color. My next costume part was the front of the breastplate. For this I actually began with a 3D model of the original Brigitte skin. Benny first bought a Papakura file from Etsy, which he then imported into Blender. He adjusted it to my own measurements and got rid of the lower half. Well, and now he had to turn this model into a paper pattern for me. So he built the shape more simplified and then exported it to Papakura Designer again. Now I cut out all the printed patterns and connected all pieces with tape. This way I got a paper dummy, which I then could use to create my foam patterns with. I roughly marked the cutting lines, separated the front and the back, and then cut everything apart again. Afterwards, I traced all templates onto 10mm EVA foam, cut them out, applied contact cement to the edges, and glued everything together piece by piece. And this is how the result looked like. I'm really happy that this complicated method actually worked out. To make the details for the next step, I had to do some freehand sketching again. I drew on the shape of my details and traced those patterns onto 10mm high density foam. After those parts were cut out, I used my box cutter to roughly carve them and then sanded everything nice and smooth. Before the next step, however, I placed a few curved foam pieces into the breastplate by bending the material a bit. This just gave it a better shape. Instead of being wobbly and loose, it now held all by itself to my body. Well, and then I could finally glue all the sanded parts on. Here was a little test setup with all the elements I've done so far. Now that I was sure that everything worked well together, I could keep on adding more details. Here I used some pre-cut foam bevels, which I linked in the video description. Next step was to cut out the booby windows. I was actually quite scared to mess this up. But it worked, you see, booby window. I smoothed out the edge and filled the hole with some LED foam. Then a few more details and some cool final battle damage carved with my Dremel. Next it was time to do the back of the breastplate. First I had to correct the shape a little bit and glue on the back collar, which was also just 2 layers of high density EVA foam. As you can see, I added a few bevels as well, cut out some holes and filled them with LED foam. To create the scary demon skull, I drew a freehand sketch first. I cut it out, twisted it a bit and traced it onto 5mm EVA foam. This way I got a simple base, which I attached to the breastplate next. For the horns I placed some duct tape stripes and drew the rough shapes onto them. These were then separated into 2 parts and cut out of 5mm foam. So once connected, it didn't look like much, but after adding a bottom I got a nice little horn. This then got covered with a lot of 2mm thick scales, which were simply attached with plenty of contact glue. This was a really fast way to give the horns a convincing texture. So for the next step, I just added some additional elements and connected the horns with the skull. Let's not forget to place this cute jaw though. Now it was time to play around with foam clay again. I used it to close the gaps between skull and horns and to shape out the whole look of the demon face. I don't have a lot of practice in sculpting, but foam clay is really awesome and beginner friendly. A little bit of water is enough to soften the material again and smooth out seams. So after adding plenty of foam sausages, placing the teeth and turning it into a unicorn, I heat sealed the foam carefully so it keeps the texture better. Then I finished the jaw, added more cute teeth and tried to sculpt out the shape a little bit more. More heat sealing, a little bit of texture with my Dremel, and this was the result. Cute, right? Now let's move on to the belt. As you already saw before, I made some rough sketches and traced the shape onto 10mm EVA foam. I grabbed my Dremel and gave it a more three-dimensional look. Then I connected the left and right side, covered the back and cut a hole in. Oh, super simple so far, right? Just a little bit of foam clay here, some teeth there, an extra piece here, and the snappy belt buckle was done. To get the belt itself, I made a pattern directly on my dress foam. I traced the shape onto 10mm EVA foam, cut out and Dremeled plenty of scales, and attached them one after the other onto the belt. And done. Oh right, and then I hated it and remade the whole damn thing. You see, too much texture. This is a lot better. Okay, next to the corset. For this part I used one of the breastplates I made for my pattern collection. Link again in the video description. I basically just stripped off the booby part, drew on the shape I needed, and cut the excess material away. Afterwards, I made a second duct tape dummy based on this shape, separated it into 3 parts, and traced those onto foam. The resulting gaps were then enforced with white wobbler and cut out with an X-Acto knife. I carefully pulled out the foam, soldered a bunch of LED strips along these curves, attached some wires to connect them, and placed them into the gaps. I actually used contact cement here as well. The connection plugs were pulled to the inside of the corset. The circuit consisted out of an Adafruit trinket with a LiPo backpack. In total, I soldered on 3 switches and 4 connection plugs. If you want to learn how to install cool LED strips yourself, please check out my advanced LED book or watch my other videos. So once the circuit was done, I covered the LEDs with 2mm Plastisode and then another 10mm on top. And this is how the first light test looked like. Yay! Next up, the right shoulder. This was my base, pretty simple. To bring it into shape, I added another layer that was slightly shorter. After this, I spread glue all around the edges and finished them with some larger triangle foam bevels. So far for the base. Next, I made some pyramid spikes, just like I showed you before, and attached a few of them to the pauldron. I also used 2 layers to create the lower part of the armor. After getting rid of the excess material and connecting it with the top part, I added some final details and the right shoulder armor was done as well. That was quick. Now to the glowing medallion. Here I began with a LED strip that I soldered into a spiral and then glued onto a piece of wobbler. The light test worked fine. Now some foam around the edge white wobbler on top, LED foam on top, and then the final layer with the details. So far so good. And now next to the last and final piece of this video, the hip plates. My basic pattern looked like this. I used 10mm EVA foam as a base and glued 2 mirrored pieces together with a slight curve. To make this part less wobbly and more round, I actually glued a second layer underneath. Then I connected both of them, cleaned up the edges, and got this nice basic hip armor as a result. Using my initial pattern, I also made some additional layers for the hip armor. These were also made out of 2 layers of 10mm EVA foam. Next, it was time for some carving work. As you can see, everything was still super rough. So next, I cleaned up the area with my Dremel and created a scaly texture at the same time. Now this already looked so much better. Following that, I spread some foam clay here and there and placed the claws as well. Simple contact cement was enough to mount each layer and to connect all parts to one another. Then, based on this shape, I made a new pattern, which I turned into a large beveled edge. Sanding this large piece took forever though. After I was done, I glued this part on, finished the foam clay areas with my Dremel, made a few further elements out of high density foam, and attached them onto the hip armor. Now I placed this last element, added a little bit of battle damage with my Dremel, some texture with my soldering iron, and the hip armor build was done. Fancy! Here is how all those armor pieces look together. Everything held up only with duct tape, since I didn't add any attachment yet. Still, I was quite happy with the result. Well, and now it was time for priming and painting. My primer of choice for all armor parts was Flexbond. It's water-based and can easily be applied with a brush. I mostly used 3 to 5 coats on all parts, depending on how rough they were. My husband Benny helped me a lot with the paint job. As always, most of the paint we used was Vallejo Model Air. To start, the translucent foam parts were first covered with some yellow. Then a little bit of orange around the edges, and then a tiny bit of darker red. The result already looked like the stripes were glowing. And as you can see, the LEDs could still shine through. Now I had to mask off these areas though. For this job I used a thin flexible masking tape called Nitto tape and carefully applied it all around the edges. The rest got covered with green frog tape. Again, please check out the video description for all the product links. Afterwards, I covered the whole corset with a light brown base color and then darker red. The brown just helped me to make the red more covering. Benny then added some shadows around the LED lines and even used his brush to give it a little bit more texture. Then I carefully got rid of the tape, and Benny finished the paint job with a thin dark line along the edges. The completed paint job was then sealed with some satin spray varnish, and the wires inside were secured with hot glue. For the attachment of the corset, I wanted to go with eyelets. Therefore, I marked the right spots, used my leather hole puncher to get some clean holes, covered the eyelets with super glue, and placed them onto the front and also to the back of the foam. I'm really glad that this actually worked out. Now I was able to wear my foam corset almost like a regular corset. Well, and this is basically how I painted every single part of the armor. First light gray and a little bit of red for the edges, and then some brown shadows in the corners and the sanded carvings. So far for the base color. Then I sealed the paint job with satin spray varnish and started applying oil paint all over the belt. This technique is actually called washing. You make it dirty first and then wipe most of the paint away again. I used simple brush cleaner for this step. As you can see, the paint only stayed in the lower areas, which made them look more interesting this way. Afterwards, Benny also used a brush to increase the effect even more. Well, and once done, we applied a final layer of satin spray varnish and finished the belt buckle, which was already painted. No worries, I'll show you how to create this cool silver effect later. We also already painted this plastisode piece, which I then only had to cut into shape, cover with glue and place into the buckle. Then I attached some LED strips onto the back, added more glue and connected the buckle finally to the belt. Just had to hide these wires somewhere. This obviously didn't hold very well, so I secured the bond with plenty of good old hot glue. Well, and for the attachment I sewed some fake leather stripes and placed Velcro on their ends. The other side got then soaked with hot glue and was attached to the inside of the belt. The Velcro counterpart got some glue as well and got onto the other side of the belt. To make sure it wouldn't get loose at some point, I sealed all 4 edges with even more hot glue. Actually, I did the same for the other side of the belt. This simply keeps it really tight around my hips and holds up much better. So once done, I had to connect the wires to the corset, close the inner and outer Velcro attachment, and the belt was done as well. Next to the breastplate, which I had already primed. Just like you saw before, Benny painted the LED foam parts first. He started with a little bit of yellow, then orange and finally red. He also tried to recreate the honeycomb look from the reference. Masking this off, however, took a little bit more effort. Even with flexible tape, this part was really tricky. So now that the LED foam was protected, I could base paint the armor with bright brown. Then I applied silver and Benny added some shadows. The next step was to mask this area off as well. As you can see, I used flexible tape for the edges and then frog tape for the larger spots in between. Well, and then it was finally time to apply the red paint and for Benny to add more shadows. Pulling off the tape was, as always, the best part. I even reused my tape strips to mark some additional areas, which I then dabbed with dark silver. This helped me to get a nice clean edge. After I was done with this, I applied some gold onto the triangle edges. Sadly, it wasn't very covering, so I added another golden wax paint on top. The result was really shiny. Now Benny added some bright highlights and darkened the shadows on the red a little bit. He also roughly sketched on the honeycomb pattern for the booby cups and then drew them on with a brush. Well, and last but not least, we sealed it as well. Next, I made another LED spiral, stuck it to wobbler and attached it to the inside. Looked promising. For the attachment, I did the same as for the belt. I covered some leather strips with Velcro and hot glue and placed them all around the breastplate. Some Velcro here, some Velcro there. Yay! Now to the back of the breastplate. Since the steps were mostly the same, I'm gonna speed this up a bit. First, Benny painted the translucent parts and I masked them off. Then some brown, some highlights for the skull and all the tape. Afterwards some silver, darker silver and more tape. The amount of tape I used for this project was kind of ridiculous. Then came red, shadow red and pulling off the tape. God, so much tape! Once done, this was my base color. Now the golden borders. Some silver highlights, honeycomb texture and spray varnish. You can truly guess the next step. Right, oil color washing. Benny covered the whole skull in brown and then he wiped it all off again. This part was really messy. Next to the LEDs, I cut a hole for the skull, soldered some more LED strips and placed them at the right spots. Spooky, right? Then I took some more Velcro strips and placed them where they would connect to the front of the breastplate. To mount it onto my mannequin, I just had to connect a few plugs, close the attachments, and done. To hide the seam on the front of my corset, I built a few scale plates, which I then just hot glued together and added some more Velcro too. Now for the color. I don't think I need to go all over the painting steps again. We applied the color basically just the same way as we did before. Sealed everything with spray varnish and then did some oil color washing, which really helped to make it look like it was made out of real bone. The difference is quite awesome, right? Then we fixed a few spots, sealed it again, and hot glued it onto the breastplate. Super professional solution. Next, the medallion. Whee! Super speed. And done. But how would I ever connect this piece properly? Alright, hot glue and Velcro. Ta-da! So we are almost done now, I promise. The snappy shoulder was next. Again, I started with light brown, then some good old taping, plenty of silver for the borders and spikes, and darker shadows. I masked off the edges, dabbed on more shadows, and then got rid of the tape again. Now Benny covered the gum and teeth area with a very dark red. Taping this all off would have simply taken too much time. He then brushed on a brighter red on top, gave the teeth a fitting paint job, and then finished them off with thin brown lines. Finally, a coat of satin spray varnish. Benny also finished the LED foam half sphere with yellow, orange and red, and added a honeycomb pattern with his brush. Next it was sealed. I applied some glue to the inside, to the half sphere, and connected them both. Then I cut away the excess material, placed some padding to the inside, covered the whole mess with some thin foam, and glued on Velcro pieces for the attachment. So far so good. The corresponding leather strips were glued to the top of the collar and the breastplate. And this is how it looked like. Believe me though, this took way longer in real life. Anyway, I'm pretty sure I don't need to show you how I painted the other portion. The mounting worked pretty much the same as for the other side. I just added some extra padding, a few Velcro pieces, and this part was done as well. Whew! And now for the last part of this already way too long video, the hip plates. Again done in super time-lapse mode. Brown, silver, shadows, red, more shadows, demasking, dabbing, flipping, textures, orange, dark teeth, thin lines, sealer, Velcro to the plates, strips to the belt, and mounted. Bam! And done! So these were all armor parts I finished, mounted onto my mannequin. I'm really happy how the light effects turned out and how the LEDs still shine through the painted film. The microchip and LiPo battery are actually still loose in the back of the collar. I might make this a little bit prettier later. Of course, I also tried all of these parts on myself. The costume itself is pretty lightweight and comfy, which is great. EVA foam is really awesome for large projects like this. My movement, however, is obviously very limited and bending forward is pretty much impossible. My actual progress of the costume looks like this though. Some details are still missing, but most of the armor parts are already there. I'm trying to show you the complete costume in the next video, so please be patient.
Oh my god, it's that late and you're still here. Congratulations for making it until this point. You guys, like all 5 of you, are amazing and you are so much better than these pathetic weaklings who had to go to the bathroom or whatever and dropped out at like minute 20 or 25 just because this video is far too long. But you are still here and I love that. So thanks so much for watching, and if you still have any questions left, just write me a comment in the video description down below. And as I said, if you want to get into cosplay crafting yourself and learn some cool techniques, check out my cosplay crafting books on kamuicosplay.com. This really helps us, and yeah, you can also support us by liking and subscribing to our channel, and also hit the notification bell to see the next video, and also consider to support us on Patreon. This also really helps us. And yeah, I hope the next video won't take another 8 months. As I said, I'm quite close to finish the whole costume, so I hope we will see us very soon with part 2. Bye bye.